All right, everyone, I am restarting this. Okay, everyone, sorry for having to restart. It seems like Zoom changed my meeting ID for some reason, so it was not initially letting people into the meeting. And so I'm trying to make sure that I can let people in. And we're gonna go ahead and get started in just a minute. So if you were on the other Facebook Live, please go ahead and get on this Facebook Live. So that way you all will be on the correct live. I'm gonna share this very quickly onto the page. And then we can go. All right. Okay, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about deconstructing racially biased crime statistics. And essentially, this is really important because as of recently, people have been sharing lots of numbers, trying to use them to justify certain movements, trying to use them to delegitimize certain movements, and overall just using them in a fashion that is incorrect, and is not the type of information that we want to use. And so in doing this, I hope to basically deconstruct why crime statistics can vary, essentially why they're biased, and just in general, why we've seen so many different numbers that may support things that we know aren't true. And so this is the presentation for today. So just general overview of some things I'm going to talk about. What is crime? What even is a crime essentially? What do we call crimes? Why is data biased? People tend to think that numbers and science can never be biased, but that is very untrue. And what policies affect that type of data collection? Initially, when I was going to host this event, I had many people ask me about the Ferguson effect. And so it's the reason why I decided to kind of, again, host this event. So crime is a behavior either by act or omission defined by statutory or common law as deserving of punishment. The idea of crime can sometimes feel very obscure. When it gets down to it, it's what the state deems as a punishable action. Now, whether that's a violent action or a non-violent action varies, but overall, these things come directly from the state as we are given. And then very quickly, I've got a video from our Eric Holder. All right.
A recent study reported that half of African American men have been arrested at least once by age 23. Overall, black men were 6 times and Latino men were 2.5 times more likely to be imprisoned than white men in 2012. This overrepresentation of young men of color in our criminal justice system is a problem that we must confront, not only as an issue of individual responsibility, but also as one of fundamental fairness and as an issue of effective law enforcement. Racial disparities contribute to tension in our nation generally, and within communities of color specifically, and tend to breed resentment towards law enforcement that is counterproductive to the goal of reducing crime. We know from research and from experience that when people are treated fairly by police and other justice system agencies, They are more likely to accept decisions by the authorities and to obey the law in the future, even when they are penalized by criminal sanctions. Last July, following the verdict in the case involving the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, President Obama spoke out about the need to promote better understanding between law enforcement and young men of color. He specifically directed the Justice Department to work closely with state and local law enforcement agencies to develop training and other innovative tools that can help to reduce discord and restore trust. Well, we are heeding the president's call. This month, the Justice Department is launching a new initiative, the National Center for Building Community Trust and Justice, to analyze and to reduce the effect of racial bias within the criminal justice system. The center will be funded through an initial competitive grant award totaling $4.7.
Okay, so we don't need much more of that. But one of the reasons that I included that little bit from Eric Holder is because, as you can hear, he does address the fact that we do have a racial bias in our justice system. But what he fails to address is kind of looking at the fact that it's not that Black people don't obey crime or different groups of color. It's the fact that there are multiple things that contribute to that, including what types of crimes we're even arrested for, and how those crimes can compound and be elevated. So even coming directly from our own justice entity that's supposed to protect us, you can see that there's still some misinformation. And so just generally, we have 4 types of crime. There's personal crime, property crime, incomplete or unchoked crime, which is considered like attempted murder, for example, a crime that wasn't completed, and statutory crimes. Now, these crimes are the 4 main types. So everything that exists falls underneath these in some sort of category. And when we're looking at the numbers and how the people in the US that are of disadvantaged communities end up getting arrested and kind of over prosecuted for, more often than not, they can be, whether it's in property crimes or other sort of smaller crime area. We're not looking necessarily at a large amount of these federal level felonies. So with that being said, there is a huge racial bias every single time we talk about crime reporting. It's something that has to be addressed. It is an essential part of this conversation because racial bias in crime reporting is by various areas. So when we're talking about underreporting of crime, this is the concept that crime is less reported for certain groups, especially those who are white. And the fact that in Black and Brown communities, certain crimes are also unreported and are likely to be less responded to. So when you underreport crime, the demographics and the numbers for that area of crime and those people affected by that type of crime will be much lower. But when you overreport crime, then you'll have higher numbers because you're getting a gigantic sample out of one population and a smaller sample, if any, from another population. And last but not least, over-policing of certain communities. So we have under-policing and over-policing. Over-policing tends to be one of the biggest contributors because over-policing in crime statistics is a reason why we see larger numbers for Black and Brown people, and essentially why sometimes people who are whether it's anti-Black Lives Matter or in general just anti-civil rights will use those numbers because they'll say, well, if Black people are committing, this amount of crimes and the amount of jail has, this many people in it, why should we feel sorry? And it's because it's over-policing. So Black and Brown communities, like I just said, are over-policed for petty crimes and ignored for major ones. This is such an essential concept because when we think of policing, more often than not, like I talked about in the last presentation, people tend to think about police constantly arresting murderers, stopping rape, stopping these, big, heavy types of crimes that tend to be even felonies. And that's not what's happening. As I talked about in the last presentation, most of police interactions have to deal with small tickets, whether that's something to do with driving or a different area, and they're not these large scale things. But because Black and Brown communities are over-policed for these smaller crimes that are easier to kind of add up, you'll see the stats higher in that sense. So again, really big issue on that. And it's something to keep in mind, again, throughout this whole presentation. So a couple of policies that relate directly back to why crime statistics are biased are stop and frisk and the 3 strikes rule. Stop and frisk refers to a brief, non-intrusive police of a suspect. The Fourth Amendment requires that before stopping the suspect, the police have a reasonable suspicion that crime has been, is being, or is about to be committed by the suspect. Now, although that they define this as a necessity for there to be reasonable suspicion, we all know that reasonable suspicion can really be justified for just about anything. Police can use reasonable suspicion if they see that a taillight is out, or they think something's odd, if they think someone's driving too slow or too fast, or even if they think that a car may have been stolen based off of a report that might have happened earlier. And so it's something that, again, it seems great, it sounds like it works, but when you really look down in deep, we understand that stop and frisk is deeply and inherently biased. So stop and frisk policies in New York have been a large controversy. We've heard about them in the presidential election with many candidates from New York running, and we've seen them talked about for the last few years in larger amounts. And so I know this is a big paragraph. I'm going to read it for you all. So in 1999, Black and Latino people made up 50% of New York's population, but accounted for 84% of the city's stops. Those statistics have changed little more than in a decade. According to the court's opinion, between 2004 and 2012, the New York Police Department made 4.4 million stops under the citywide policy. More than 80% of those stops were Black and Latino people, and the likelihood a stop of an African-American New Yorker yielded a weapon was half of that of white New Yorkers that were stopped, and the likelihood of finding contraband on an African-American who was stopped was 1/3 of white New Yorkers that were stopped. So not only are they stopping Black people at an extremely high rate, Black and brown New Yorkers, but they were half and 1/3 as likely to have things that would have been considered items that they would expect to find for the cause of the stop and frisk in the first place. The fact that only half of Black New Yorkers actually had a weapon that were stopped compared to the white New Yorkers is essential. And think about this. If you're stopping 100 Black people and half of those Black people have a weapon, that's 50. But if you're only stopping 30 white people, then only 10 of those white people will have, or only 15 will have a weapon. And so the numbers look smaller, but realistically, it's just because the percentage of people that are being discussed in the talk to in the first place is already overblown. Policies. So again, on more policies, the fact that the researcher's data comes from a biased sample, which is who police chose to stop, rather than the full sample of possible stops, skews the conclusion we draw from. Now I want you to think about this, what I just said. If you're already looking at a larger number, you're gonna have larger numbers for that group because you're looking at whether it's 2 or 3 or 4 or even 10 times the amount for one group than another. So it seems like it's really a really large amount, but it's really not. And this, again, was a really great data that I found from Allison P. Harris, who's a political science professor at Yale. She talks about this issue a lot. If you Google her, she's got some amazing stuff to read up on. And she talks about, again, that with policing, we can never know what there's no record of. So if less white people are being stopped, we won't have a record of anything. We won't have a record of whether or not they did commit a crime or whether or not they're getting put into that system because they're just not being stopped at the same rate. So the 3-strike law. This, again, has gotten a large amount of attention recently, which I'm fairly happy about, but it's a law that has been really detrimental in Black and brown communities. It is essentially supposed to be 3 strikes and you're out. So if you have a few petty crimes that are considered serious, then eventually when you get your third strike, so you get arrested a 3rd time, you are then sentenced to a very high sentence. So it's as simple as, for example, somebody having a certain amount of weed on them 2 times in a row, and then that 3rd or 4th time that they have weed on them, even if it's a small amount, it adds up and it compounds. So the idea of a compounding punishment. Bill Clinton most famously talked about this because this was passed across the country in 1994, whenever Bill Clinton introduced the crime bill in the early 1990s to try and fix overpopulated prisons. The idea was to pass a bill that would limit the amount of people that you're seeing in and out because these people would not actually be coming back, allegedly, because they would think if you're not repeating the crime, then you don't deserve to be in prison. The problem is that whenever you're monetizing the amount of crimes, it becomes an entirely different conversation that needs to be had. Also, this is something that has been deemed unconstitutional in some places, but it is still very, very, very much a part of certain systems. I think California still has it enacted, and it's contributed to a large amount of the prison system being filled, even though that was the opposite of what was intended. And another thing Bill Clinton said on this, which is, again, not great, is that he says that the bill had helped the biggest crime drop in history, which, if we look at numbers, that doesn't actually add up. I'll show you some numbers in a little bit that show that we have seen certain crime increases in certain cities and in certain parts of the world. So, data bias. Data bias, again, can be biased by the people who analyze the data. So if the people who are actually looking at the numbers and coming up with the conclusions on what the data means have a bias, they will come to biased conclusions. And when we have biased data that was drawn out of biased conclusions, the sample that they use also might not have been representative of the entire population. So if you're using a sample of 100 Black people but 30 white people, and you're doing it in one neighborhood that's poor and one neighborhood that's more wealthy, then you're going to come up with entirely different numbers. And if you decide to compare those numbers, it's like comparing apples to oranges. And that's basically what most of our data is used as, is comparing apples to oranges. And so we're not even starting off on a familiar playing field to actually realistically compare the numbers. And so depending on how get data is gathered, like I just discussed, is really important. An example that they use about those severe learning statistics is that, for example, if you have an increase in ice cream sales and an increase in sunglasses sold at the same time period, people will try and say that the increase in ice cream sales is what led to the increase in sunglasses sales. Now, if you think about that, that doesn't make absolutely any sense. Obviously, buying more, people are not buying ice cream, which is then making sunglasses sales go up. If you actually step back and look at the data from an unbiased stance, you'll think, well, what is happening during these two times? What else do we see that's increasing? And you'll see that the heat is increasing. So as it becomes more summery outside, you'll see more ice cream sales, more sunglass sales, more sunscreen sales. But just because the data is correlated does not mean that it's cause. And that is something else that we'll talk about. And so why statistics don't capture the full extent of the system in bias and policing. I shared this with you all because I think that this is a really great resource to kind of look at and consider. It is written on 538, which I always think they have interesting takes. And so you can look up this article yourself and kind of read along parts of it. But to summarize, all of the data, when you look at it, seems to overwhelmingly point to a criminal justice system that is driven by racial bias, but it's actually even more racially biased than we can even comprehend, because we don't even have the actual numbers to compare on the amount of, for example, white people being arrested versus not being arrested. And so we're really speculating based off of what we have, and what we have is not correct. And there's also a statistical quirk called collider bias, which is a selection bias that means that the crime data that shows racial bias is biased by racial practices. And so collider bias is rampant through any type of racial data that we look at, and it makes the analysis even clearer in a sense, because we can use that to talk about this. Another great article that I'll reference throughout this is Understanding Racial Bias and Machine Learning Algorithms. This was written by an education group that actually focuses on technology. So it's, again, a really great article, and they have a great site to look at. And they decided to publish this in June after everything kind of blew up with the Black Lives Matter movement. And a couple of points to point out in racial data analyzing is that a lot of what we use has to do with automation. Automation can be extremely biased, because in order to have automation, we have to use algorithms, and we create the algorithms to use automation. We often find patterns that may not be predicted easily by automation, because automation is dealt with algorithms, and it's only done by experimentation. And once you have those experiments and you decide to use those small experiments on an entire system, if those experiments are not racially biased in themselves, say they aren't racially biased, the algorithm still can do unpredictable things. And so even using automated things is really not a good area for us to look at for doing racial data analyzing. It also said automation poses dangers whenever data is imperfect, messy, or biased. So anytime the data is not exactly how we want it to be, anytime it's not simple and very easy to look at, automation is really put at a weak point, and it's incapable of properly digesting this data. And if it does digest data that is slightly imperfect, then it'll reinforce unintentional implicit bias that were created by the creator of the algorithm in the first place. So an example of this is in 2018, they used a facial recognition tool in law enforcement, and it misidentified 35% of dark-skinned women as men. The error rate for light-skinned men was only 0.8%. And so thinking about that happening and how big of a difference you are from 35% to 0.8% in this data could have led to really bad results, and it probably did lead to really disastrous results. Additionally, a 2019 study revealed that a healthcare algorithm reduced the number of Black patients identified for extra care by half. So it decided to put 50% of Black patients at a non-need for additional care. And in fact, it gave a much higher level for white patients. Since the algorithm was trained on the proximity of healthcare costs, it assumed that healthcare costs served as an indicator for health needs. However, Black patients spend less on healthcare for a variety of racialized and systematic reasons. So algorithms really can't be neutral in any sense, in any way of the word. Algorithms can never be neutral. And in fact, another thing that I think we have to talk about, and I'll put this on my phone, is the fact that science is often thought to be unbiased by many people who are not familiar with it, but science can never be unbiased because in the end, anything that is influenced by people will always have a bias by those people. Now, how we kind of shift the bias can change some of the effects of that bias. And so if you can reduce bias effects by, for example, including a wider variety of people working on a project in the first place. So if you have 5 people from California working on the same project from the same city, you're not going to have as wide of a variety as a viewpoint as if you brought a person from Texas, a person from New York, a person from Wisconsin, a person from Florida, and a person from California together to kind of work on a big project. You're going to get, there will still be a bias, but the bias depends on how you diversify and what you diversify. Also, just a reminder for people who are asking questions about science, science can be based completely on race and improper racial information, which can really be necessary whenever we talk about this. For example, just look up phrenology if you're unfamiliar. Phrenology was an extremely racist ideology in the theory of evolution. And I'm not going to get into too much of that today, but it's important. So again, the notion that mathematics and science are purely objective is false. There is no such thing as a purely objective science. There is no such thing as purely objective science necessarily. Everything and anything will have bias. Data itself cannot account for histories of racial oppression and dealing with complex social factors. Things that are intangible and aren't easy to count, like for example, negative racial reactions or interactions are not something that we have enough data on because they are not necessarily taken in the right context. And again, if you're using an algorithm that was created in a setting that is biased and you're dealing with data that's imperfect, like racism, because racism is, you know, an intangible subject, then you're going to come up with numbers that are extremely inaccurate from the system. And another thing is to consider is we're talking a lot about technology, we're talking a lot about numbers, people who are developers, people that deal in computer science, and 68% of developers are white. And if you think about that, 68% of people creating this data are white. So it's not, we're not having the right people necessarily even in numbers come in order to really look at this and understand. And going just slightly off topic, in most computer science programs, real racial comprehensive numbers are not taught. So they're not even taught necessarily to really look at how race is affecting the numbers that they're gathering. And overall, there's just been a big issue in science where more often than not now we're seeing a very big pull for attention-grabbing headlines. We're seeing a big pull for studies that are kind of trendy and cool. And so the way that people have been sampling for a lot of studies is extremely biased and inaccurate. Another thing to mention, just again, one more time, science, math, and anything relating to it are not exempt from social, historical, political, or economic factors at all. All of it is very much informed by this. So on to the next slide. So correlation does not imply causation. This is one of the biggest quotes that you're supposed to be taught whenever you're studying statistics. And it's really important because when we think of correlation, correlation is just simply showing two things that move in a direction that could be similar. Causation is saying that one thing actively caused another. And then when we think one thing caused another, but it's really not correct, again, we're misinforming ourselves on the issue. And this quote refers to the inability to legitimately deduce cause and effect relationships between two variables solely on the basis of an observed association or correlation between them. A lot of mouth, it's a big mouth jumble. But essentially it's like the example I just gave earlier about ice cream. Just because ice cream sales are going up and just because sunscreen sales are going up does not mean that ice cream are causing sunscreen sales to increase. Doesn't make sense when you think about it. Now, this comes from Daniel R. Stadler, who is a PhD. He does data analysis and also psychology work. And he gives the example of police behavior and how the pulling over, again, of certain groups is going to influence that data. Black drivers are more likely than white drivers to be pulled over by police for similar behavior. Many argue that the race of the driver is causing police officers' behavior in a case of racial profiling. Through racial profiling, though racial profiling could be a major factor, it turns out there are other research-supported contributors. For example, there's a higher police deployment in neighborhoods that have higher crime and higher poverty rates, and that therefore means that there will be a higher proportion of Black drivers. And that higher deployment means more pulling over of Black drivers over other drivers. This is a study done by Kowalski and Lundman in 2007. And so, again, I feel like I've been repeating myself a lot, but just so you guys can really understand this issue at its root. Now, the Ferguson effect. I was asked to do one of my deconstructing seminars on the Ferguson effect. And the Ferguson effect is, this is the just definition I pulled off Wikipedia because it was the easiest, most comprehensive definition. The Ferguson effect is the theory that increased distrust and hostility towards police can lead to an increase in violent crime rates. The theory was developed in 2014 after they saw an increase in violence after the Michael Brown shooting in Missouri. That's the simplest definition I could find. The definition of the Ferguson effect will vary based off of the political views of the page, the person, and the researcher that you were talking to. I was going to pull up and show you all the different definitions that I found, but just in doing so, there's just so much misinformation on here. Now, the Ferguson effect is, the thought is that police are becoming afraid to police in certain areas, and so therefore they're pulling back, and that's fueling an increase in crime. And a problem this one brings up is that in crime is that if it implies that if crime goes up because police are retreating, that's the fault of the public for making police scared. I could talk about why this has so many issues involving it, but I want you to think about the fact that people are saying that the public is scaring the police away from an area, and that is making the crime rates go up in that particular area. This was created by, I remember his last name is Dotson, but he also wrote the book that said that there was a war on police. So again, not an unbiased source. And whenever he was talking about it, it's been about two years since I think he last spoke on it, or since he started speaking on it heavily. And it's that there's little agreement about what the Ferguson effect is taking, or even if it exists. And there's not a consensus about whether or not a national crime wave is actually occurring. Part of the thought is that behind the Ferguson effect is that we're seeing a large increase in crimes in places essentially that are protesting civil rights. And then again, in 2017, there was a large study done. It's one of the biggest studies on crime, and it looked at crime rates in 81 American cities the year after Brown's death. and it found no overall increase in crime. There were a few cities specifically that we saw spiking upward trends of homicides in, and those cities were Baltimore, New Orleans, St. Louis, and Washington. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to talk about Baltimore specifically and on a national scale, rather than honing in on the other cities, but that will be something that if you want to reach out to me about, I can talk about later. So, Baltimore. Baltimore Police Department's budget went from $480 million in 2017 to $497 million in 2018. Even though they cut after school programs and there was an insufficient spending could have prevented 115 layoffs in the city's public schools. So 115 different people were laid off in the school. The programs were cut for after school budgetaries, but then the police budget increased from 480 million to 497 million. That's a $17 million increase. And that's what I want to point out. Something doesn't add up. Let me explain why. So if we're saying there was an upward spiking trend in homicides, that's point number one. When you keep all of these in your head. But then we're seeing a $17 million increase in the police budget, but we're saying that police are policing less because they're afraid to police more. That does not actively add up. And it's really an unfair thing because none of the information that I looked at correlated these three issues. Just to kind of, again, make sure you understand what I'm saying. If we're saying that crime went up and there were more homicides in Baltimore, the police got $17 million more in the same year that number was reported, but police started policing less because they were afraid, and that the Ferguson effect affected Baltimore, people say, because police were afraid to police in areas. But that doesn't make sense because essentially not only are we blaming people for police being afraid of them, but in the same year that they took all this money and increased the police budget, they also took money away from different after school programs and they cut funding. And they also fired numerous faculty and teachers that were a part of the public school staff. You cannot say that there is some conspiracy where people are killing each other more for no reason, and that it's because police can't police whenever the police received more money than before. And this, again, goes back to me talking about defunding. I'm hoping to post the defunding webinar I did 2 weeks ago soon. It's really long, so I can't publish it easily. So I'm going to break it up into pieces. But again, $17 million more, and all it did was create more crime. And that's, again, because we're not putting money in the right places. Over time, as we've seen crime increases, we have also seen monetary increases to police administrations across the country. And if you're seeing those two things correlate, we're not saying that one thing are causing another, but here we can point directly to causation, because we see that as the budget was decreased for schooling and for after school programs were completely cut, and an increase in police officers were given financial money, then clearly there's an issue. And it's something that I, again, didn't see anybody in all the research I did point this out and point out this trifecta that creates the Ferguson effect ideology. But just in case you don't understand, the Ferguson effect is really not real, because this effect is created by things that are completely out of citizens' control. There we go. Now, I liked the fact that this quote came up, and it said, "In what other field would a failure to succeed lead to an increased investment for the failed approach year after year?" Again, if you want the numbers, it's on my last presentation. And if you see police departments get more funding every single year, but you see crime increase every single year in select cities, right, because this is debated as we talked about, then why are they still getting more funding? And this is, again, a conversation for why we must effectively defund police, because the burden is being placed in the wrong place. Essentially, the information is incorrect. And so the right numbers aren't being correlated or compared. We're not talking about, what was defunded at the same time that something was funded. Typically, we only talk about what was funded at a higher rate and the crime that appeared in a certain area. We don't talk about the resources that were taken away from that area at the same time that something else was funded. And when we don't talk about the right numbers, we ignore the actual root of the problem. Now, a big report that I'm sure many of the people who are 50 and up will know is the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, also called the Kerner Report. If you were alive and able in 1968, then you were a part of the generation that saw Lyndon B. Johnson basically establish in a commission in order to address the problem of rioting. This was after MLK discussed that rioting was the language of the unheard. And he explained that riots were essentially a direct cause of white supremacy and of part of our policing systems. And so in order to kind of figure out whether or not this was true, Lyndon B. Johnson asked for a commission to be formed and for them to do reports for 7 months. So they investigated for 7 months and released a book. It was a 426-page document, and it sold 2 million copies instantly. It found that riots resulted from Black frustration at the lack of economic opportunity. And when we're talking about rioting as a result of economic frustration and a lack of economic opportunity, we have to talk about where the economics are going. That's another reason why I've been so heavily influencing and talking about money and funding. Funding influences every area of systematic racism you can think of. There are certain areas that kind of tie back in together when we're talking about this. And in addition to funding, we have to talk about policing. We have to talk about the prison system. And I'll do a call on the prison industrial complex probably in a month after the next one. And how much it intersects. And King was a very big proponent on trying to make sure that this was expressed fully to folks. He said that the report was a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life, that the report essentially gave the exact steps that needed to be taken in order to reduce and prevent things like this from happening in the future. The report also found that poverty and institutional racism were driving the inner city violence, and that they were the biggest factors in some of that crime that's considered to exist. And here you can see a copy of the book. If you're on my Instagram Live, I'll post a picture of it. But this is a copy of the text that has all the information on it about what basically essentially are the next steps in order to preventing riots, and making sure that we're actively addressing the question rather than chastising people for something that they didn't create. Now, another thing that this report found is that as Black unrest rose in areas, inadequately trained police officers and National Guard troops were entered and affected neighborhoods, worsening the violence. So as the riots were occurring in certain areas, and again, we're not talking about, 1 million people doing something. We're talking about a few thousand people in places across the country. Millions of police troops and federal folks were deployed in those areas, and many of them were undertrained. And when you're sending undertrained people into areas who are increasing the violence by inciting violence, who aren't properly trained in the first place on some of these things, all you're going to do is have more violence. And so whenever we look at certain numbers and why certain numbers of alleged Black on Black crime are higher in certain time periods, or even just in general Black crime, the concept that, again, is false. We have to talk about these types of situations that elicit that type of response. And they're creating literal hotbeds of crime, making the numbers look larger. So whenever we go through time and we see that, like, oh, there was a spike in crime in the 1960s and 1970s, and they were initiated by Black Americans. Not necessarily true. And the report also addresses some of these things as well. I definitely recommend people read this. It's a big book, but if you just go through the front and kind of look through what you need, there is a lot of different division of the topics, and so it'll be easy for folks to kind of just go through and see what's important. So last but not least, before I answer any questions that anybody has, are some book resources. These are the 3 books that I think are the most relevant to this. I have a larger list, but I like to vet the books first, just to be sure. Ghetto Side is a book by Jill Leovoy. It talks about urban violence, and it really actively addresses a post-Ferguson world and how things can be harmed in cities by police. And again, how sometimes the interaction with cops and Black and Brown Americans can kind of create this increase in numbers that we see that is then misinterpreted by the lack of proper diversity and the lack of proper information reported back to the people who are then taking those statistics and actually going through them and reporting them to people. The book also talks about where she actually visits different places, and also talks about the prison population some and the rate of Black men being murdered, just in general in homicide numbers and in relation to police killings. We also talk about in the book non-fatal gunshot wounds and fatal gunshot wounds. So, okay, great book. The second book is the U.S. Riot Commission Report, which I just showed everyone. If you're on my Instagram Live, here's a little picture of it. And again, great book to read, really huge. You don't necessarily read it from front to back, but just being able to skim through kind of some of the findings is really essential, I think, in order to being able to do this work. And last but not least is a book called Black Stats, written by Monique W. Morris. It talks about everything in relation to Black numbers. So we're talking about the numbers of Black people that are married and that are not married, the number of Black people that get divorced, the number of Black people that have children, the number of Black people that live in apartments versus houses. This book is a big anthology of Black statistics that are in relation to Black people in the country. They do address, obviously, some of the discrepancy between statistics, and a large part of the book is talking about why certain numbers are higher or lower, what numbers may be accurate, what numbers might not be accurate. So again, great book. Now, last but not least, I'm going to show you all, just for those of you who want, I have all the resources listed. If you're on my Instagram Live, I'll post this. And so these are everything that I use in order to make my presentation today. There are a couple things that are left off, but it's mainly the books that you all saw already. And if you want to do the research for yourself, you can look up any of these. I also will share this for anybody who sends me their Instagram and wants them to be shared, or anybody who sends me their email and wants me to send it to them, because this is just a really important part, I think, in kind of being able to have these conversations and really understanding, I think, the depth that statistics have on us. And so next time somebody uses statistics somewhere and says, I can prove, like with these numbers, that this group did this and this group did that, you won't be confused as to how did they get those numbers, because more often than not, they relate back to these things that we talked about today. If anybody has any questions, I can either answer them now or through email, which I will always respond to. And I want to thank you all for joining me today. Bye-bye. Oops, I didn't actually end it.